for it. Enjoy. Perfect. So we're live, and welcome to those of us who are joining us perfectly on the hour. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. And we'll just get started in a second once we have everyone coming in. So today's topic is an alternative protein investment, which I'm sure we're all very excited to hear about because there's been lots going on in that sector already, especially in the last few days. So let's see, we'll just again hang on a little bit to see who's joining us. For those who are joining us live on Facebook, welcome as well. Perfect. Right. So it's great to see so many people who are here right on time. Congratulations on being on the dot. And with that, you know, let's start the session off. So very warm welcome from Thought for Food. My name is Marie, and I'll just quickly introduce today's session, which is all about alternative protein investments. So a record of $930 million was invested in companies which produce plant-based meats and dairy alternatives or cell-cultured meats during the first quarter of 2020 alone, according to 2 studies released by the Good Food Institute. Just this week, we saw Canada putting a fair bit of money into their alternative protein sector as well. And so today in this topical roundtable, we're joined by 4 international investors from the alt protein space. We've got Cessna Mack, who's an investor at Powerplant Ventures, Gary Lynn, who's founder and MD of Purple Orange Ventures, and John Friedman, who's the director of Asia and AgFunder. And we'll talk about the latest developments in the buzzing sector. Are animal-free food products already becoming mainstream? And if not, how can investors and startups help accelerate the developments in this space? So today's session is hosted by North American TFF regional coordinators, Ayna and Sujala. So I'll hand over to you, and I'm very excited to hear where the conversation will take us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marie. And welcome everyone. We're so excited for today's panel. I know this has been a top of mind conversation and thought for everyone within the food space. So just as a format for what today's session will look like, for the first hour, we're just going to have a conversation between ourselves and the panelists. We have some questions that we are sure have been top of mind for you. And then for the last 30 minutes, we're going to hop on into Q&A. For our panelists, you're welcome to answer any and all questions you'd like, and we'd love to see you build on each other's thoughts. So we're going to first start with some introductions, and then we'll jump straight into the questions. So my name is Ayna. Like Marie mentioned, I am the North American TFF coordinator. I also run a corporate accelerator, and my prior experience is in advising startups, consulting, and running my own CPG company. So very well versed in the space.
Thanks, Ayna. My name is Sujala. I am the regional coordinator for North America based in Toronto, Canada. I grew up in India and have been living in Canada for about 15 years. So familiar with the North American ecosystem. I am a entrepreneur and a food scientist who used to work in startups and multinational food corporations, but 3 years ago, I left that role to pursue my entrepreneurship journey into the plant-based food space. So I'm happy to moderate this conversation today. Just also working in the alternative protein space, I am really excited to see how this conversation shapes up.
And for our panelists, I'd also love if you could give us some insight into how you ended up in your current role and what really inspired you to be a part of the plant-based and all-protein movement.
Ladies first, Cessna.
Thanks, John. My name is Cessna Mack. I'm a growth equity investor at Powerplant Ventures. We invest in plant-centric food and beverage companies, including Beyond Meat, Just, Appeal Sciences. We're on our second fund right now, so it primarily focused more on the emerging growth space. So we lead or co-lead Series A and B deals for companies making at least $5 million in revenue, with some seed deals as well. Our first check-in is about 4 to 8, and we reserve 100% for follow-on, and typically look to be the partners to help companies commercialize and scale. In terms of what brought me to the space, I joined Powerplant at the end of last summer. I come from a management consulting background, worked primarily with consumer retail companies, but was looking to help entrepreneurs pretty much achieve their dream, and wanted to focus on the health and wellness space as a way to make a positive impact in the world. My parents were refugees from the Vietnam War. I'm originally from Texas, and they started a small convenience store and never scaled it from that one. And I was more inspired to kind of bring to light the dreams of everyone else that are looking to really make a positive change in this world, like a lot of people did for me.
You wanna go, Jack?
Who's going to make the first move? All right, Gary. Thanks. Good evening from Singapore. My name's John. I'm the director of Asia at AgFunder and director of our Agri-Food Tech Accelerator program here in Singapore called Grow. Hopefully most of you are familiar with the name AgFunder. It's a digitally native agri-food tech specialist VC based out of Silicon Valley. We've been around since 2013. At this point, we've got relatively 4 smaller funds targeted across the agri and more recently food tech space. We launched a dedicated alternative protein fund last year. At the same time that we were expanding our geographic footprint into Asia, which is when I joined the team. So my background is actually investment banking. One of those towers behind me is where I used to work. And that's what brought me out to Singapore originally in 2007. I grew up in Hawaii, spent some time in the UK. So I like to think that I've got a pretty global palate when it comes to cuisines. And I think, what motivated me to take the leap from the corporate space into the really nascent agri-food tech sector here in Southeast Asia was that sort of mission-driven, impact-minded philosophy, which I think all of us on the panel here and most of you listening would share. I think having been in Singapore for 13 years now, and as a Singaporean, we have such an extraordinary passion for our food. But what started, I guess, raising bigger questions for me was just the sort of disconnect between society and the food system. We import 90% of our food here. And clearly in recent COVID experience that those fragilities have been laid bare. So hoping to lend my voice and efforts and help drive AgFunder and Grow's work in expanding the ecosystem here in Southeast Asia and delivering more sort of positive change to the food system.
My name is Gary Lin, and I run an impact seed fund focused on supporting entrepreneurs and scientists that are leveraging technology to specifically displace animal food products. And I am American, but most of my working career has actually been international and came from a very different industry in digital media, advertising tech, that was admittedly very capitalistic pursuits. And that was a 20-year trajectory. My own startup lasted 16 and a half years. When I was able to finally fully exit and close the chapter on that project, which was 3 years ago, decided to focus 100% on impact investing. I had done a lot of angel investing in every category that you can imagine, but I've been fascinated with just this idea of impact investing and if capitalism can be a force for good, right? I've been following this social entrepreneurship movement and the rise of the B corporations, and set up a small team to start looking at different pillars of technology that were seemingly addressing the sustainable development goals. And we narrowed down to a few topics, and it was intellectually very stimulating, but quickly realized that we have to focus if we want to really understand the mechanisms at play and ideally add some unique value to the equation. And the topic of cultivated or cell-based or cultured meat just really ticked all the boxes for me. So personally around the topic of animal welfare, but also it was the one topic that was just so catastrophic on so many different levels. And a lot of top tier investors were entering this space 3 years ago, almost exclusively in the US, but all the international teams were popping up. And once we made that deliberate decision, it was just very clear in terms of how we needed to kind of inform ourselves and get a good grasp, on the landscape. And momentum has really been picking up. And I think personally, I spoke with 1,000 teams over these last 3 years, from cultivated meat to microbial fermentation to a lot of the novel plant-based initiatives. And now in Europe, we're also looking at creating a company builder to provide more infrastructure, more de-risking, specifically for scientific technical talent to be able to plug in and allow them to do what they do best and, and move much quicker. So global investing, early stage, a lot of deals happen to be in the US, but we are looking in every market.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We will get things started. So as we were discussing, the US plant-based meat, egg, and dairy alternative companies have received about $2.7 billion in venture capital investments in the past decade. And 45% of that is just from 2019 and Q1 2020. And 9 of the top US meat companies have capitalized on the plant-based shift, having launched or bought or collaborated on a plant-based with a plant-based meat brand by the end of 2019. So despite this great growth so far, the field needs more capital and resources in order to meaningfully transform our food system to a secure, stable, and sustainable one. So as investors, what do you think makes a alternative protein company unique and more investable compared to others in the space? And how can a startup that's just starting out stand out? If Gary, you can start shedding some light on that, that would be great.
Yeah, for us, we're looking for underlying innovation and technology, not for technology's sake, but as a real lever to create something that's much more transformative and that can appeal to the masses. Being here in Berlin as a, I think it's a self-proclaimed vegan capital. We have people from London. I spent time in California. Everything seems to be moving towards plant-based, but globally speaking, it's tiny, right? And global meat consumption is still set to rise significantly. So right now, the verdict is still out in terms of what approach will be able to create uncompromising, indistinguishable meat analogs, meat, egg, and dairy analogs. And so we're looking at all the different, different types of applications, different kind of methodologies. But through our analysis and from speaking with teams, I think utilizing, going back to the molecular, chemical, nature and building blocks to be able to design products seems to be very crucial if we really want to create something that is going to not only appeal to vegan and vegetarians. So for us, we're really looking at science-based teams. We're looking at teams that have some type of entrepreneurial track record. Sometimes these are 1 profile, sometimes these are 2 profiles. And in our conversations with these companies, we're doing a lot of matchmaking as well, introducing people to one another. There's a lot of movement, and it's very dilutive also amongst all the investors, a lot of money sprinkling in a lot of different places. And I think what we need for, especially ecosystem building, is we need more breakout successes, especially outside the US, where arguably we already have some very large, substantial players, but outside the US, we have virtually none at that kind of level. And I think if we want to make sure that the rest of the economies are participating in the future of food, we need to centralize and concentrate more resources on fewer but better projects.
If I can just, I guess, expand on Gary's thoughts. I mean, here in Asia, alternative protein or plant-based protein has been around for millennia, right? I mean, that's always been the argument. And so I believe that up until 2019, the excitement or hype was largely dismissed. I would say, our biggest challenge here in Asia right now in the food and the ag tech space is just getting investors to participate. And part of that, again, was the fact that we've been eating plant-based meat analogs for so long. But I absolutely agree with what Gary says around the use and implementation of technology. As an investor, that's what we look for. You have to have some sort of moat or IP around your product or your company for us to believe that it's investable. We tend to shy away from the pure CPG type brand products. That's just our own decision, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. But I think, you know, the important aspect of having that sort of technology adoption is the ultimate product, which Gary talks about. You know, just as an example, I know it's sort of relatively early days in the meat analog, or I should say how do I put this? In China, obviously we've been eating a lot of gluten-rich and soy-based non-meat products for a long time, and just in the last 12 months, you've had a number of Beyond and Impossible wannabes pop up on the scene, you know, pretty much one per major city, tying in with a celebrity chef. The funny thing is, pretty much all of them are being manufactured by, you know, one of 3 or 4 major sort of OEMs across the country. So the end products are all relatively similar. You know, they've got their slight different sort of variations in the recipe mix, obviously different sort of positioning, but you know, there's not a lot of differentiation there. We are starting to see some more, I guess, novel or creative ideas coming out in terms of, you know, blends with plant-based and, you know, animal, you know, adopting that. I mean, at the end of the day, I still think, you know, there's a large sort of social education that needs to happen, and whether I'm still, the jury's still out in terms of, you know, if it's fair or if it's justified, you know, in terms of trying to tell someone that, no, you can't eat meat, you should only be eating plant-based. If, you know, they're part of a rising consumer group, it's tough. So a number of challenges out here in Asia. I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I agree on that.
Can I add just one? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was also going to ask, how important are certain factors, like whether it's clean label or sustainability of the ingredients that are being used in these alternative protein products, or even efficiency of systems that are being designed for cell-based technologies? And that, I feel like those are not really being part of the conversation that's happening currently. So how can we incorporate more of that, or how important are those factors for new startups, and if they can use some of those things to differentiate their niche?
Just to touch a little bit on that, on the previous question, and hopefully tie this in, being at slightly a later stage of investment, to the first question of like, how can you not just be a copycat, or what's differentiated? We invest in companies typically that are over $5 million, and obviously a lot of, you know, the cultured meat stage are not quite yet at commercialization, but something we think about as we are developing these relationships, because we very much believe in this space and think it's a way to help take animals out of the food system in a productive way. But I think what we look at predominantly is what new problem are they trying to solve? We were investors in Beyond Meat, and that relationship came from the fact that 2 of my partners were the co-founders of Veggie Grill, which is the largest vegan fast casual food chain in the US. And they were seeing just incredible innovation and new delicious products coming out. And they knew Ethan Brown early, but this was when he had initial chicken product that wasn't necessarily ready for Veggie Grill. But when he hit his burger product, the reason that they saw that as a big standout was because the thought at coming at it, and I think with Impossible too, and those leaders that really helped carve the space for us, especially in the US, is the idea that they were looking to not just create the best plant-based meat product, they were looking to create the best burger. We thought of them as expanding the pie rather than competing amongst other competitors within it. And so when we look at new products or new categories, we're likely not investing in another burger company because there's one that has really broken through already. But we're curious about maybe the chicken space. There's lots of form factors between tenders and breasts. There's lots of innovation. We were also investors in Just, and in egg space, there's lots of new innovation that's happening there as well. And so when I think about it, it's what I agree with what Gary says, is in terms of tech, not just to have tech, but something defensible on an investment side to show that you're solving a new problem that hasn't really been done yet is something we're looking for. And then to your question, Sujala, about clean label, I think current environment has just shown that it is incredibly important and also increasingly important to understand your supply chain and to be transparent about it with the consumer, because I think a lot of the innovation in the alternative meat space is a little, from a commercialability standpoint, consumers are a little nervous about it still. There's a lot to learn. Is it safe? What does it mean? Am I still eating an animal? Like, is that okay? How do I feel about that? So I think it's important for companies just to know where they stand and to be very clear about where their products are coming from, how they're approaching their problem, and bringing the consumer along in that education journey, because I think it's going to take a while for people to feel comfortable in this space.
And maybe I can just add a little bit on, I assume there's a lot of entrepreneurs, out in the audience. And I think that's the salient point of, what problem you're trying to solve, but also where do you have a unique skill set to really take that project further, right? So I think I see a lot of founders trying to maybe orchestrate or design a package to also appease, investors. And I think that's also the wrong approach. Right now, there's just, it's frustrating because I see a lot of really passionate entrepreneurs that are getting bad advice, right? And yes, you don't want to innovate for innovation's sake, but you also want to do what you do best. And if it is a recipe company, just a formulation company, and it's focused on sales, marketing, and distribution, because that's where you have your skill set, that's not necessarily a bad place to start. It is crowded, it's harder to differentiate, and maybe that's not a focus for certain funds. But these things all are worthy, and more options we have in the store shelves, even if they are mediocre options, is generally, I think, still good. And again, these technologies will invariably intersect, right, with blended and hybrid products. And if we have these novel ingredients, whether it's microbial or cell-based fat, that comes down the pipe, gets through regulatory, consumer acceptance issues, they can really augment and again lift these plant-based products to another level and have even kind of higher sensory satisfaction. So I think that's one point. And then the point on clean label, zero carbon, circular economy, I think we have to be careful as well. It doesn't matter if the company is, a single founder with no money, or even just, a big company that raised hundreds of millions. The resources are always constrained. And I think it's very important to be clear again on what problem you're solving and what is the execution plan. What is the step plan to actually solve that? I see young entrepreneurs, especially, maybe overly idealistic, trying to tackle all of these things at once, right? Sensory and taste and new kind of input and sourcing, and they're growing their own, microalgae, and they're trying to use, solar energy. They've just increased the complexity 100 times, and the chance for failure is also dramatically increased as well. So I think, and I think Beyond Impossible have made that claim clearly. They're looking at sensory first, right? Then nutrition, and then we look at sustainability. And yeah, I think entrepreneurs have to be really careful. We see a lot that are maybe just overzealous, and if they sell it to investors, expectations are also increased, and then there may be a mismatch in terms of expectations.
I think just building on that, one of the first things that I get really, really curious about is, since this is a very global panel, what are some of the things that you've seen expedited due to COVID? Like, what are some of the trends that are popping up, and are there any surprises that you've seen due to COVID within the space?
I think the biggest change has been the increase in webinars around agri-food tech. No, it's, everyone's talking about it. And if there is, a silver lining from the whole COVID experience, and certainly what we've experienced, speaking in terms of, what I've seen here on the ground in Singapore, but I know clearly the same has been replicated in the US and other places, just, this extraordinary supply chain breakdown, empty supermarket shelves, all the rest of that. I think the positive flip side, obviously, well, besides more people being aware of the problems and hopefully, more attuned to solving them, and hopefully along with that comes some, additional investment capital. It's seen this sort of mindset shift in the young entrepreneurial graduates, etc. I mean, just to give you an example of what we've witnessed over the past sort of 12 months here in Singapore and Southeast Asia. So our accelerator program launched last August, and we, leveraging the AgFunder brand, we did a global call out for applications, and it was rather generalized in terms of who we were, what sort of companies we were looking for. We thought primarily applicable to sort of more of the high density urban populations of Asia. So yeah, just use that as a description. We received 8 applications from Singapore, despite the fact that we're based here, and this was the sort of first agri-food tech accelerator in Southeast Asia. And obviously, right around the same time, the government had come out with this really strong agenda around solving its food security issues. They called it 30 by 30, with the goal of increasing its domestic production up to 30% by the year 2030 from currently roughly 10%. It got a few headlines, and a few people talked about it. This is back in sort of early 2019, but actually at the same time, that's when Impossible came to market in Hong Kong and Singapore, and so there was this wave of excitement around plant-based, at least, and everyone started talking about plant-based and alternative proteins, which was good. It was the first step, but really there was a lack of, again, I spoke about my motivation around sort of reconnecting with our food system, reconnecting from the source. There was this just massive lack of understanding as a sort of import-reliant nation where our food's coming from, until COVID hits, and all the shelves are empty, and everyone's like, Malaysia closes the borders, and within 24 hours, boom, nothing's left on the shelves. So yes, I'm grateful perhaps that everyone's a little bit more conscious of this now, and hopefully is a little bit more mindful of our consumption patterns and where the food's coming from, and perhaps that will eventually lead into stronger demands for sort of labeling and traceability and all that stuff. Because right now there's very little consumer demand for what I would sort of consider as more developed markets, nice to haves as opposed to need to haves. Right now it's all largely cost and taste. So yeah.
Yeah, just on the COVID question, we see a lot, I guess, on the other end of that supply chain, the companies that had strong direct consumer access in online channels saw a huge surge of business, right? And I think there is a huge opportunity of not being constrained to even just kind of the typical retail outlets. And I think consumers now are more open. Not only are they more conscious and deliberate in terms of their purchasing decisions, but they want to have a relationship with the products that they buy and consume. And we're seeing even existing companies that had strong online customer bases, but even new startups saw that as a major contributor, sometimes the biggest contributor, compared to even retail. And we see new, vending machine technologies, just looking at access, right? Like I think that's also a huge constraint we have of just affordable, accessible, healthy food. So this is just one observation I've seen, in addition to just obviously increased demand in plant-based and immune boosting types of products.
Saw similar trends there across the US as well. So more focus on supply chain transparency that we're talking about, and trying to understand where food is actually coming from, and people actually caring more about sustainability and health and wellness for themselves, but also for others. On kind of the CPG side of things, we saw a lot of people more interested in immunity boosting products. I think a lot of brands also just started to use that tag and leverage it as an opportunity as well. But I think that really did help to highlight a lot of our brands that are focused on the power of plants to help you build immunity from the inside out. And that was a really great opportunity for for consumers who are at home sheltering in place to, take some time to listen to the brands and, as Gary said, like have a real voice. We saw a lot of, I'm sure at other places as well, but lots of shift in calories from food service to CPG. So not eating out as much as restaurants, but staying home, learning to cook more, focusing more on comfort food, but also the better for you options, and trying to discover ways to shop for those products online. And then from a company standpoint, I think, one of when COVID really started hitting the US and people were staying home to shop, the main channel for a lot of our CPG brands is retail. And so we very much worked with our companies hand in hand to support them in rebudgeting, doing downside scenario planning, focusing on cash, and looking to get to profitability as quickly as possible, as opposed to just focusing on growth, which is normally what we support with.
And maybe just real quick on the investor side, where I saw actually increased activity, not necessarily in deals, but just in terms of inquiry and interest from fellow investors, has been in cellular agriculture, right? Fundamentally, most of the solutions that I see being funded are important, slightly incremental, but ultimately won't get the job done when we just look at food safety, food security, and obviously the disastrous, environmental effects. So a lot more inquiry from other VCs, family offices, impact investors around, can we have a fundamentally a different way of producing food, right? Are there advantages to microbes and fungi and mycelium and cultivating animal cells that are just inherently much more efficient and much more controlled, high kind of growth rates, full kind of amino acid profile that just has significant advantages from the starting point. And I see that trend continuing to happen. Way more investors outside of just kind of this impact sphere is beginning to really be interested in these topics and looking for expertise and trying to figure out how they can educate themselves and then ideally take advantage of those opportunities. And we also see a huge proliferation of international companies in this space, where most of the synthetic biology, cell cultivation stuff was happening in Berkeley, and now we see a lot of clusters all around the globe, especially in Europe, that have launched strong teams backed by both international and local investors.
Gary, I think you raise a very interesting question, which I would love to get the other panelists' perspective on as well, around what kind of investors are you seeing that are trying to get more and more in the game, and like, what is the profile of the people? Like, are you seeing more corporates that are now interested? Are you seeing, like you mentioned, family offices or angels? What are some of the new players that are trying to get into the space, and what have you perceived to be their focus like?
If I had to rank, and again, this is just anecdotal of what I'm seeing in terms of the biggest increase in Europe, at least, family offices. A lot of these family offices also own big companies, potentially in the food space, of a few $100 million to a couple billion. I think there's a sense of responsibility in terms of the legacy they want to leave behind. Secondarily, there is a huge shift in terms of generational transfer of wealth. The younger generation is taking over these businesses, and they are obviously thinking much more in terms of global and around topics of sustainability. I see faster activity there where they can make more kind of independent decisions, and they're setting up family office funds. They're setting up CVCs. They are willing to take some of these riskier bets. I mean, they're riskier, but they also, and they're more binary, but they also potentially have more transformative effect. VCs are still quite slow. I mean, they have in a way, I would argue, somewhat of an outdated model that just really confines what they're able to do. Again, from an impact perspective, that's what I'm seeing in Europe, at least.
I think it's a pretty similar picture that we have out here in Asia as well. Perhaps maybe 10, 15 years slower, though. I think one aspect which Gary pointed out, this transfer of wealth between generations and the ability for younger, more perhaps impact-minded asset owners to get involved and get invested. I would say, if you sort of profile the top 100 families or so, family-owned businesses here in Asia, which hold the wealth, there's still a lot who are perhaps in the sort of second generation, maybe a very early third generation. But as more of that wealth transfers down, and the new inheritors, I guess, have a sort of more open-minded outlook for investment, sort of strategically, as Gary mentioned, potentially they have core business lines in their business groups, which could benefit from some of these strategic investments. But I would say, compared to centuries and legacies that are established in Europe or even in the US, we are a little bit behind in terms of that momentum. One thing which I'd like to see more activity of here in Asia is the corporate buy-in. I think there's some really strong activity. The precedent has been set by the US and a number of the CVCs that are active. Obviously, I know it's been a mixed couple of years for certain companies in terms of their ongoing activity. But I think that's something which I'd love to see more of happening here. I mean, we have a handful of, actually, more than a handful of, some really significant food players across Southeast Asia, North Asia, etc. And the way that they look at innovation and investment, I think, is perhaps slightly outdated or hasn't quite caught up to different geographies. So I'd love to see sort of more participation in that space.
Yeah. In the US, we have investors from all angles, whether limited partners, strategics, et cetera, very interested in the space. I think, again, Beyond Meat and Impossible really helped carve the way to show that it was possible to build a company that brought on new markets and also, took animals out of the food systems, demonstrated that it could be more environmentally sustainable. And that's kind of the thesis for our firm as well, in terms of trying to make the world a happier, healthier, more sustainable and ethical place. In terms of on the limited partner side, lots of new interest from, as you said, I think as both of you said, on the family office side. I think our model is also built off of an idea of conscious capitalism and the fact that you can build businesses that actually create more good in the world if they succeed. And so I think that more people are very interested in wanting to make that happen and see a path for that through plant-based and through alternative protein, for example. And we've seen other investors and other VCs in the space and across different industries as well. So some from the tech side, especially investing in the earlier stages, some CPG venture capital firms looking, and even private equity firms looking to make more plant-based investments and bringing their leverage there. And so I think, while that maybe leads for more competition on the VC side, I think what's exciting for us is that there is more attention on this space because the mission is to take animals out of the food system and move forward a plant-centric
exactly.
future.
It's such a large topic that it's not winner takes all, and you don't have the same kind of network effects that you do in digital types of businesses. And I think substantial players can emerge in all different geographies. And we're also seeing investors much more open to invest across geographies. A lot of the Asian deals, at least within the more science-based kind of food tech companies, I would say predominantly, led by Western funds, mostly in the U.S. And so I think that's a great trend. And also with a lot of young entrepreneurs out there, what's happening now is every accelerator incubator program is global, right? Like you can attend any of these programs and get kind of a world-class education and a great network to be able to learn from, where I think, even kind of pre-COVID, that was definitely limited.
Great. John, you touched earlier on Singapore's the 30 by 30 mission, and we're also seeing so much more activity in emerging markets, whether it's driven by the governments or whether it's driven by just startups playing in those geographies. the Good Food Institute is also doing an incredible work spreading the mission around the world. I think some of them are here on the panel, so just a shout out to them. Also wondering if there are certain trends that you see in those markets that will win, and what are they?
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to the friends at GFI. They published earlier this week this fantastic, what is it, the list of top 100 alternative protein disruptors. It's, focusing on the Asia region specifically. And it's, through work like that, I think, which is going to continue to attract more interest, more investment capital, more entrepreneurs into the space. I realized when I was referencing our accelerator activities in an earlier response to a question, I didn't quite complete the story. So when we held our first cohort late last year, we attracted, it was like 8 Singaporean companies. And just this month, we are about to kick off a virtual program now. Obviously, realities dictate, but it was more, we've designed it to be more focused on the Singapore sort of challenge statement, the need to increase productivity and domestic production. And so what technologies can we identify and accelerate here from around the region? Because to be honest, we weren't convinced that we'd be able to fill our entire cohort based on experience from the previous one if we were only looking in our own backyard. But it was a really fantastic turnout in terms of both the number of applicants that we received from the sort of Asia Pac space, just over 80, and 28 of them came from Singapore, so a significant increase from 8 just a few months ago. And look, I think the way that we sort of constructed the mission statement, or the types of technologies that we were looking for, was again largely influenced by what Singapore needs, which clearly isn't going to be the case for what Malaysia needs or Indonesia needs. When you're talking about, it's a very different food system. But one thing which has stood out, in addition to technologies supporting sort of controlled environment agriculture, and I recognize we're kind of deviating away from the alternative protein topic slightly, but we had a lot of controlled environment agriculture ideas, given we have no land here in Singapore, so everyone's growing either indoors or on rooftops. And then more around the sort of traceability and digital supply chain, which was quite neat. And then I think, again, perhaps this is slightly more of a developed country type focus, but the focus on ingredient plays and biofortification of foods, which I think obviously is moving in the right direction. But again, the reality when you're sort of operating in or trying to create solutions for emerging markets, it's simply going to come down to cost. So yeah, actually there was a really exciting sort of hackathon event, which we attended at one of the national universities last year. And again, this was just really encouraging to see from a country which hasn't really put a lot of focus or energy on sort of the food space or the food industry up until recently. This sort of week-long hackathon, which pulled together 3 of the major universities here in Singapore. We had over 100 teams turn up. So, combined probably 200 to 300 sort of undergrad students, all sort of working on alternative protein, non-soy based ideas for the Southeast Asian market. So we had everything from bubble tea replacements to sort of satay sticks that were, I think the delivery model, which the more interesting ideas were, how are we getting this product into the consumer's hands, whether it was recognizing the traffic jams that exist in Bangkok or Jakarta and designing a product which, could be delivered through the car window, or something very simplistic. So it's definitely an encouraging sign for the region in terms of the direction that it's heading.
I will take bubble tea over soy-based meat anytime. Are there certain startups that are focusing on whether it's egg replacement or whether it's cell-based meat that are coming up in the emerging markets that you think have a better chance compared to just trying to replace whether it's ground beef or chicken.
Yeah,
or there new and innovative startups.
We had some exciting news stories actually just today. I think Gary was referencing this earlier. Two of our homegrown startups in the cell-based space making news. Turtle Tree Labs, who's developing cell-based, well, breast milk is what they're focusing on now. Massive market, obviously. They just announced they closed their seed round, which was, you know, following very close on the heels of their pre-seed round earlier last year. It's a team that I've known for a long time, and, you know, fantastic individuals, really motivated to make a difference. And, you know, just across the street basically from them is Shock Meats, who sort of made waves, metaphorically speaking, in sort of, you know, being the first crustacean-focused cell-based company globally when they launched back in 2018. And yeah, so Shock sort of announced that they had closed, they had wrapped up a bridge round, which is leading very soon to a Series A. We can perhaps even expect that before the end of the year. So fantastic, I guess, yeah, really from nothing to now having, you know, two very exciting cell-based startups, which we can sort of call our own. And as Gary mentioned, attracting some significant investors from around the world. There's clearly a lot of focus by the Singapore government to develop the nation as a sort of center for food tech for the region, and a lot of capital going into it. Just earlier today, the government announced another $50 million worth of grant money being set aside for agri and food tech startups. Again, trying to get to this 30 by 30 and make it happen. But outside of Singapore, we had, you know, a number of applicants from around the region, especially some really interesting, slightly more novel takes on plant-based coming out from Indonesia, Malaysia, and India for this food bowl program that we just launched. So egg being one of them, I think that's it's going to be, obviously it's a huge market in India, and this one particular company, Evo, they've got a really interesting looking product, sort of sourcing more locally, obviously, which is going to be key for its, I guess, viability, both in terms of price point and just sort of supply chain. That's what we've got to figure out.
No, and I just want to add, I'm really grateful of all of these teams, and I know all of these founders like Evo and Shock and Turtle Tree Labs. I think they have this extra burden of being a little bit of a pioneer in dealing with regulation, trying to understand consumer acceptance issues, trying to source talent where people aren't fully aware of, you know, some of these technological approaches yet. And in a way, it's not an easy task, but they're doing very important work, and also being quite transparent in terms of sharing their story. And, you know, I see that on social media and blog posts of their journey and some of the challenges. And I think it's fantastic that they're being very open, you know, with that, because that will inspire a tremendous amount more of participants and entrepreneurs that jump into the space, right? I mean, we talk about these emerging markets, specifically Southeast Asia, but also China. I know a lot of entrepreneurs looking for scientists. I know some, you know, scientists and researchers trying to figure out if they should actually start a company. And we need them to be able to, number one, better find each other, and also not be afraid that there are already companies emerging in this space. It's such a large topic. We literally could have, you know, 1,000 Shock Meats and Turtle Tree Labs, and it still would only scratch the surface in terms of how large these, you know, these industries are. So, yeah.
Yeah, John, I think you've teed up really, really well for the next question. And this is a question that has popped up a lot within the companies that I talk to within emerging markets specifically. So what they've noticed and what we've noticed overall is that, you know, the capital structures aren't as formal in a lot of these markets. And so when they try and go and raise funding, it becomes incredibly difficult. So I'd really like to learn from all of your perspectives of how can these companies within emerging markets, you know, in countries like India and like some of the smaller Southeast Asian countries and Africa, how can they go raise the funding that they need to? Should they be looking locally? And if they want to go talk to investors in another country where the capital markets are a little bit more mature, how can they go form those relationships and raise that funding?
Gary, do you want to kick off?
No, I think these incubator accelerator programs, there's no shortage of them. More science-oriented ones more focused on CPG. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of these programs, and I think they're a great and many of them actually don't even take equity, right? So, and they've built up a great roster of consultants and mentors, and now that's basically open for, for everyone. And I think that's a great starting point to be able to get those relevant introductions, across the globe. I don't think anyone, especially when we look outside the US, I don't think any one ecosystem or hub has all the ingredients to really make a big dent in terms of solving this future food topic. And there has to be a lot more bridging across different geographies and food tech clusters. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, of just taking advantage of these programs. And they all know each other, and they're all quite connected to the most active investors in this space globally.
I think
exactly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Cessna.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think that's great advice. And if I were a startup in the space, that's what I would look to do as well. And I think the point about it is being able to spend your time on finding the right investors. And I think those startup or accelerator, incubator, company builder programs are the right place and can introduce you to that network, because I think that will attract the right stage of investors as well. So while, for example, for Powerplant, while we do some seed, we are not necessarily using our capital at the moment to help companies with R&D or to do facility build outs, but we're there once you get that up and running, then we're there. But we do like to form those relationships early. So we do look to these incubator and accelerator programs as well. So even for the next step afterwards, it's a great introduction to any market, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I will just sort of add a comment. I mean, I can't downplay the difficulties and the challenges facing founders in emerging markets. I mean, when we've made some investments into Indian companies, and just with the capital regulations, it's just difficult sort of transferring money in and out. There are just sort of regulatory hurdles which we have to face when we're investing in, or the deal flow is fine. Like, obviously, well, now it's tricky, we can't travel, but I think it's just sort of for entrepreneurs and founders to take advantage of, there's so many different sort of access platforms to get your word out, get your name out, whether it's, like a Kickstarter type campaign, or obviously the social media platforms. There's multiple ways to sort of get your sort of product market validation, attract interest, and then, if you're the right company and you've got the right product, then the investors or those early stage accelerators will start sort of reaching out to you as well. Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, even with what Thought for Food is doing is great, of putting a huge repository of content and training and mentors and consultants that's just accessible. We need more of these central repositories of these gravitational forces to bring the people together, to be able to find each other and ideally create even more balanced, stronger teams. I mean, GFI is great at doing that, and they have a ton of amazing lists. If you're looking for, looking to join a company space, looking for a co-founder, a list of research grants that are around the globe. You can enter your company into their startup database. You can access their investor database. Right now, definitely strong in a few geographies, but with their subsidiaries and representatives around the globe, that is becoming much more international.
Yeah, great point. Thanks for sharing that, all of you. And I just want to quickly remind attendees to put in their questions too. We're getting close to the hour mark. We will start taking Q&A soon. But one last question. I know we've, I guess, touched on a little bit about both eggs and dairy and meat alternatives. And are there still ideas or, sorry, areas we can explore? Are there areas that are currently being overlooked? And any key innovation that you wish has sparked already that you would like to see, rather than some of the repetitive ones?
I think the general answer is, you go to the grocery store and you see, at least for us looking at displacing animal-based products, you can basically systematically see where there's animal-based inputs or ingredients. But I wouldn't just limit it to what people are currently eating, right? So when we even look at continental Europe, there's a huge demand potentially for plant-based seafood, but it's just not as accessible. It doesn't mean that if it were here, the demand would not shoot up. And also the figures I think are deceiving when we say, X billions have gone into, meat alternatives. That's based on the current level of the products, right? If someone were to come up, whether they're using, cell technologies, whether they're using microbes or tapping into the natural diversity of plants, if they're able to create a product that is, uncompromising on the sensory side, that is more nutritious, that is ethically produced and affordable, you can basically assume that would cancel out the entire meat industry. I mean, that's in the vacuum, right? So I wouldn't limit it to only what people are eating now. And there's also the argument of completely novel sensory experiences, right? We're eating products today that we didn't necessarily eat a couple of decades ago. So consumer behavior is hard to shift, undeniably. But there are, I think, bigger incremental steps that could be taken to replace, this kind of center plate item, core protein needs that, that people have. And for us, yeah, plant-based seafood, infant formula nutrition is completely underserved. The pet food sector, a lot of room for improvement, and these are all very, very big, industries. Supplements and sports nutrition, meal replacement type of products, still a tremendous amount of opportunity, I would say, across all geographies.
And to that point, I think categories as well. I think, in terms of the way we look at the market, GFI actually has put out a really great, and we had lots of shout outs for GFI today, well deserved. But they put out also a report kind of analyzing, I think, Gary, maybe this is what you're referring to, just the market sizes of each of the different category. And they really drill in of like, oh, this is how large the chicken space is. This is within chicken, there's like chicken tenders, chicken wings, and what does that look like? And what's the size of that market? And I think to some extent, it does offer new entrepreneurs or people interested in the space an idea of, what that kind of back to the beginning of like, how big is the problem that I'm trying to solve? And do I want to dedicate my resources, time and energy to really overcoming this specific problem? But even if you are targeting a somewhat smaller market, like for example, bacon, not necessarily as large as maybe a burger market in terms of that problem, but like still has yet to be solved. And I think this is a time where, I'm not very good at that saying, but all boats can rise at once, of just putting more innovation to these challenges that haven't yet been solved. And if you can carve the way in that space, you definitely have a daunting task in front of you, but you I think can make the largest impact there as well. So there's lots of room for excitement across all different categories in the food and beverage space.
John, any last thoughts from you before we kick off Q&A?
I mean, just to echo the points, I think there's wide open space here in Asia. A lot of the early products have been imported, obviously, by the established brands, and most of the interpretations have been largely westernized as well, which works in a city like Singapore or Hong Kong. But again, you go to Bangkok, Thailand, Yangon, places in China, like, not interested. Hot dogs, chicken tenders, no thanks. We need the xiao long baos, we need the siu mais, we need the satay sticks, we need to be able to make a convincing xiaolongbao, like that soup dumpling, wow, killer. If someone can do that, if anyone's been to, I know Din Tai Fung is all over the West Coast, but they do this, you know, killer sort of pork soup dumpling. That's a challenge right there. If any young or old entrepreneur is up to it, I think that would be, I'd invest straight up.
Honestly, you just saying that is making me very hungry. So we'll kick off Q&A. Having said that, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom. We also have the chat open if that's how you prefer. And, you know, we'll be just taking questions as they come in. So John, I think just building off of the last comment that you had, you know, we have people from all across the world on this call, which is amazing, especially our panel. Curious to know, you know, what can the investor community do to help international tech transfer and international product launches so we're not, you know, rebuilding the wheel every single geography? Or do you think actually on the converse too, if we should be rebuilding the wheel in every geography? I think both points are fair game.
I mean, I think there definitely has to be a localization of product and, you know, the tech application. But to Gary's earlier point, I think it's fair to say a lot of the tech innovation and advancement has taken place in the US. And so Asia hasn't been shy to, you know, import and sort of copycat and innovate. And it's slowly happening. And a lot of this is sort of machinery and hardware and just having that sort of know-how. Even here in Singapore, you know, we're trying to model what we're trying to achieve for, you know, a agri-food tech center. We're modeling that after, you know, Israel and the Netherlands and, you know, aspects of, you know, Silicon Valley from the IP creation and the investment space. We need to see more of these hubs sprout up around the world. You know, obviously India, the major cities there have a core group of startups would be coming from, you know, the main cities of either Mumbai, New Delhi, etc. Africa, I can't speak very knowledgeably about, but yeah, there's a massive white space. I think, how do we transfer tech? It's, you know, it's what we've sort of been talking about in terms of having these brave pioneers and entrepreneurs being very open and honest about their experiences, trying to inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs to just go for it and make a difference. I mean, there's one thing to say, you know, you have to be, you know, mindful of your sort of IP and how much you sort of give away in terms of that, but absolutely more collaboration, knowledge sharing, open honesty. That's how we're going to move forward in this space. And it's not strictly in the sort of CPG space. It's across, you know, agricultural production and the complete sort of food system.
I mean, the good news, at least on the deep tech sides, where we do have a few breakaway companies already, invariably they're led by very mission-driven founders that are looking at as much scale as possible. And in their home market, usually it's in the US, they have more than they can handle. And I think many of them are quite active and at least very open of looking at joint ventures and partnerships, whether it's with startups, whether it's with you know, larger corporates, to help penetrate additional markets. I think it's still going to be quite a while before you know, any of these companies are able to, in a real meaningful way, tackle multiple markets at once. So on some of those, you could argue, does it make sense to recreate, I don't know, a recombinant dairy company from scratch in another country when Perfect Day raised, you know, whatever, 200 million, half of it already went into their technology. Maybe, yeah, there's something to leverage there, you know, looking at, again, where your skill sets are, and ultimately if you're adding, you know, additional impact. I think these kind of joint ventures, expansion opportunities is a little bit underserved, but there's a great openness to be able to kind of construct some of these deals.
There is a question from Constantin Sanders. Do you think there is a good opportunity and impact to be made by mixing plant and meat into the same product? If the meat industry is open for this idea or opened up to this idea, they can slowly adapt and quickly increase plant fraction. It could have a very big impact quickly. And of course, the same applies to dairy. I think we've seen a couple or more, maybe more companies in the US doing this in the meat industry already, but
Right.
yes.
No, we're big supporters of all those initiatives. Even internally, we have a idealistic, a mission, but you need to have a pragmatic approach of how to get there. And not every kind of impact fund is maybe that flexible. The first investment we made was actually into an aqua feed company, but they had the desire to actually create, a food for human applications as well. And the underlying technology is they're using CO2 from cement plants and paper mills with their own microbial bacterial mix, create a high protein food product. And at first we felt like, well, are we then supporting the aquaculture field? And what I didn't realize at the time was, 100 billion fish are raised and slaughtered for our consumption, but 500 billion smaller wild-caught fish are trawled from the oceans, ground up, and fed to that fish. So there was a clear displacement and immediate displacement opportunity we felt that was justified. And I think with a blended approach, it makes sense as long as I think you're enhancing some other attributes. You don't want to be a slightly better veggie burger and a slightly worse whole meat burger. And there are some studies showing, whether it's, using mushrooms and fungi, is it actually creating something else and not just nutritionally a little bit better. I feel like if flexitarians are the biggest market and they want to eat meat, they can just try to find the most, the cleanest label, ethically sourced meat. And then on the days they don't want to eat meat, there's a lot of other things that they can eat, right? So I think blended does make sense. It could displace it if it has like augmenting properties of what you're creating and not, otherwise it's perceived as kind of gimmicky.
Nate has another very interesting question, I think around funds available to startups. And have you perceived, I think even in any of your portfolio companies, any gaps within funding? So, if they can't raise debt or, they can't raise a bridge round, like what are some of the funding gaps that you've seen? And have you seen that they even differ by geography?
Not obviously emerging markets, Asia there's a huge deficit in terms of the amount of capital and the amount of good projects to back. Europe, I would argue that's not the case, despite what most startups say. I think for really strong teams, they're able to command the same valuations as Silicon Valley, and they're able to close their rounds very quickly, as well. And if teams are struggling, I think they should push for as much critical feedback from investors. I don't think investors are discerning and sharing enough in terms of maybe why they've passed on the opportunity. So I would encourage entrepreneurs to just solicit that advice. And invariably it has to just do with, there's some gaps, whether it's, primarily with the team. I mean, yes, planning and R&D strategy and go-to-market strategy, that's all important, but maybe there's ways that they can go back to the drawing board. And I know some teams that have struggled and they've gotten good feedback and they've tried to find some additional core team members. Maybe they've been able to supplement that with some interesting advisors, right? Because they can't maybe hire some of these people, but I think they need to present more of a clear package. So at least in Europe, I think for strong teams, there's more than enough funds, available.
Cessna, John, are you seeing any gaps, or do you feel like that, within your geographies, there seems to be enough like formal capital that companies can go raise?
Gary made the point, we have lots of gaps. Look, it's early days out here. I think fact of the matter, I mean, again, just sort of referencing Shock Meat's, a company that I know pretty well. They raised, pretty much everything up until, all of their pre-seed round came from the US. The majority of their seed round came from the US, with the exception of the lead and a couple other angels. The lead, who was a very sort of mission-driven businessman who owned a food company in the Philippines. But again, turtle tree, primarily the same example. So it's a lot of sort of concerted work by both the startups as well as the funds like AgFunder and the accelerators, right? Just to educate and build this ecosystem and convince more people to get involved. So unfortunately, right now there's still a lot of gaps.
Maybe on the US side, as was kind of mentioned, fewer gaps. Definitely investors looking from either a mission-driven standpoint, from tech standpoint, lots of different types of investors. I think one thing we encourage our companies, and maybe one where they don't necessarily hone in as much, I think Gary kind of alluded to it earlier, of, you know, identifying your key milestones and being able to share how deliberate you've been on what your focus is. So I think Gary mentioned earlier, like we have a lot of companies focusing on, you know, building a new supply chain with this interesting new plant-based item, but it's logistically it's not there yet. Supply isn't necessarily there yet, but, you know, how are you building those stepping stones to getting there, and then eventually towards commercialization? And I think that story and it's how succinct it is and how deliberate you've been on the choices as a team can really help fill in and help pull in the gaps for the capital as well, and the types of capital that you attract. Thanks
for all of your insightful answers. I think there's one very interesting question that we haven't touched on as much during the panel, and Shinyi Lim asked this. Do you think the B2B alternative protein businesses might be able to ramp up faster than some of the B2C businesses? So just as an example, you know, synthesized protein for animal feed, like if you had a corporate partner, you know, do you think you can get to scale quicker versus having, you know, a consumer-facing CPG style product? And also curious if you think, you know, one of the other is perhaps more investable in that regard as well.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the topic, and what, you know, as a ingredient play, how much of a lift are you really getting? Whatever you're tackling, is it protein content? Is it gelation and foaming? Is it fat encapsulation? You know, what are you trying to solve? And are the techno-economics there? Does the math work out that people are willing to potentially even pay a premium for that, for you know, that lift that you would get? Some of the deeper tech initiatives, it's harder, the B2B, simply because as an enabler or solving one piece, the ecosystem is too nascent. But for some of the more mature industries, if they can really, you know, fill a particular hole or gap, then by all means, that's a much more logical way of having some earlier commercialization and maybe a little bit more predictable sales cycles and a limited pool of partners that you want to actually have to go after, compared to just the really costly and difficult exercise of building up you know, end consumer brand.
Great, thanks, Gary. Nate has also shared a key interesting document in the chat if anyone wants more information on investment in alt proteins. The next question is from our Thought for Food CEO, Christine Gould. What are some of the new crops that you're excited about? What are the innovation opportunities to increase production and sustainability of the crop inputs into these food products? I'm glad she asked that question. And I would also personally like to pitch for millets as a crop for the future. There is a institute in Malaysia that's focusing on the crops for the future as well, which is highlighting the top 50 future food grains. But yes, go ahead, and whoever wants to take this first, please do.
At the risk of sort of sounding foolish because I just don't know enough about specific crops, but I was recently introduced to the Bambara groundnuts by a company here in Singapore called Namzi, a sort of scale up. They're closing in their Series B, and the founder's mission is how do we reintroduce obviously forgotten crops into the the supply chain, but at the same time allow their planting and their cropping to be sort of regenerative and increase the sort of sustainability of the plantations across Southeast Asia. So let's sort of plant some of these bambaras along the oil palm acres and acres, and add a sort of new revenue stream for the smallholder farmers, for example. And so this Namzi has, actually, I think it's native to Africa, and they've obviously brought it over to Southeast Asia now, and they're incorporating it into their food products with great effect. So a couple of the products which I was fortunate to try recently, they're doing a sort of healthy fried noodle, which doesn't have the bambara groundnuts in it, but it's just through a better processing technology, and they're incorporating other sort of native ingredients to add, flavor, color, and nutritional componentry. But where the bambara actually features is in some of their soups, which was delicious. So it's rethinking comfort foods with a sort of Asian flavor, and forgotten crops which are nutritious and increase the sort of sustainability of the plantations. So sort of ticks all the right boxes.
We're seeing a lot of startups around sunflower seed and lupin and duckweed, or lemna, and obviously with like millet and oats. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. And also just I think it was a question that popped up in the chat that I saw, also just in terms of macroalgae, microalgae. It's people are a little bit burned from the biofuel sector, but now there seems to be a little bit of a resurgence. There's just a lot of inherent advantages of looking at again much more sustainable inputs. And I think with the technologies that are available today, and the access and cost of those technologies compared to even 5 years ago, I think it's time to kind of revisit some of these ingredients, fungi and bacterial based proteins. They're all worthy inputs to see how we can really leverage.
I would echo that as well. I think fungi and microproteins are something that we're excited about as well, given that there's, they double in mass every 5 hours, and the space they need versus the space you would need for animal farming. And it's already a food that people are familiar with, and a lot of people already eat mushrooms, so it's a lot easier in terms of consumer acceptance in the new form factor as well. And there's lots of innovation happening around creating what has like muscle cut or whole cut meats that maybe these types of proteins are able to better enable than we've had in the past. So we're still really excited about that space.
Yeah, well, yeah, especially with like sequencing costs coming down, and the use of machine learning and computational biology, we can begin to characterize what these molecules and compounds can really give us, right? Low-hanging fruit, of course, is plants. There's 391,000 species that we don't even, we haven't even begun to understand. And then you look at fungi, I don't know, 5-6 million, and then you look at microbes, literally trillions out there. I was speaking with a really interesting scientist specializing on microbes, and he just said, whatever problem you're looking to solve, not only does it probably exist, it does exist in the microbial kingdom, just statistically. If you're looking for, a microbe that tastes like bubble gum, it's out there. It's just we haven't found it yet.
The next question that we have, I think, kind of ties in really, really well, as you look at all these different technologies. It's actually by my really good friend, Jessica Kwong from Jack and Friends. So shout out to her jerky. As investors, have you seen any plant-based or alt-based products that are, either at prototype stage or market ready, and it's at a small scale, that you felt had huge potential, but, have struggled with scaling up? Because the manufacturing or the processing or the technology is new or non-conventional. And how does that affect your investment decision?
I can take a stab at that one. There seems to be kind of two different camps of entrepreneurs. One that are acknowledging the heavy capex requirements of food production, and they're trying to adapt their technology and innovation within that system, which makes a lot of sense. We're talking about, you know, billions of machinery that's already put into place. And then there are ones that are trying to reinvent things from the ground up. For sure, they're going to run into that hurdle, right? Of they maybe developed a, you know, interesting extrusion technique to get some type of fibrous, you know, texture, but now, you know, there's no co-packers, co-manufacturers that can actually, you know, do this, and they have the difficulty of you know, of building hardware and new equipment and convincing, you know, these firms to be able to make it worth their while to adapt, and the demand isn't there necessarily there from day one. So I don't know which one's the best approach. I think, again, all are worthy, and hopefully these things will converge, and hopefully we'll reach a certain critical mass where these enabling technologies continue to just prop up the, you know, the whole industry, where more innovation can just be, you know, plugged in or stacked on top of one another. But we're not quite there yet. It looks like the ones using existing tech, because it's just the easier route. Again, it's, you know, we haven't done a huge survey, but from the samples that we just receive, they're not quite there yet. Maybe for hardcore vegan vegetarians, but a lot of those products, I find it difficult imagining real meat eaters buying on a consistent basis. You can even argue some of the breakout companies, how much of it is novelty and how much of it is really someone saying, you know, I'm willing to compromise a little bit on the sensory, but the benefits I get in terms of sustainability and, you know, ethics, I'm going to buy this over the animal derived version, you know, from this point on. I'm not sure.
Can I just inquire, is that Jack and what's the name of it again? Is it jackfruit beef jerky, I'm guessing, or?
It's plant-based, so Jack and Friends, made out of jackfruit.
Jackfruit jerky?
Yes.
Okay, I'm totally going to look that up. Thank you.
There is a question from Rebecca Shen. Oat milk has seen the largest growth within the plant-based milk space over the last year, mostly driven by Oatly, which seems to lean on its CPG branding versus technology-based MOAT. I'm gonna sound ignorant here for a second. I don't know what MOAT means. Does your same principle of technology-based moat apply to plant-based milk as well?
Maybe you could take this one, Sujala.
I agree that Oatly has been around for a couple decades, and we have only recently seen oat milk trending, obviously thanks to Oatly. I know, Gary, you're pointing at me because I am in the alternative dairy space, creating a Beyond Meat version for plant milk, because as much as there is a highly growing players in the plant-based milk sector, there is still not one product that is a complete replacement for dairy milk. Yes, there is a nice play on branding by Oatly, but I think the opportunity is still there for a better product that is nutritious, that has a clean label, and that uses sustainable ingredients. Oat definitely touches on oat and pea milk like Ripple, or there is some other pea milk players emerging as well. There are some brands that are doing well in matching the nutrition, but not necessarily a complete nutrition. We're still not talking about the complete protein with all the essential amino acid profile, or even the complete micronutrients like calcium or iron and some of those key minerals. And then almond milk comprise about 63% of the total alternative dairy consumption in the US. So that shows that it's still not a very viable or the most sustainable ingredient to create plant milk, considering how much water consumption or water usages for growing almonds. So I think we still have ways to go in matching nutrition, affordability, and sustainability when it comes to plant-based milks. Anyone have anything more to add to that? Okay.
We clearly have a plant-based milk expert on our panel here. There's been a couple of questions that have been popping up around, what you see the potential in things like insects, algae in the seaweed space, and if you see any potential for these types of ingredients in terms of both consumer acceptance, but also deriving high protein products.
I'd like to hear what the other panelists think about the insect space. I'll be very upfront. I got in a bit of trouble last year when we hosted a alternative protein event. It was sort of amidst the wave of excitement after Impossible landed in Singapore, and I just felt that there was so many other brands and products on the market which needed a bit more sort of just publicity. And thank you, Nate. I see him recommending that I speak to the guys at Karana. I know Dan and Blair very well, and they've got a delicious product. So yeah, anyhow, organized an alternative protein tasting event, which included, different brands, including Karana, Hura, which is the chicken. Obviously, we had a bit of Impossible and Beyond thrown in there, just for good measure. And look, I incorporated a cricket flour as part of our dessert, and I made sure to market it as alternative protein, and everything in the menu was listed out very clearly. But I did still get in a bit of trouble the next day when certain individuals who thought that it was a vegan event discovered that they had eaten cricket flour. So I admit, mea culpa, but there's a company that I think we've been talking about tech enablement and potentially pivots in terms of technology as young founders. There's a company which came through our accelerator program last year called Future Fields, working out of Edmonton, Canada. And without giving away too much stuff, the example here is that they sort of pivoted their sort of technology platform to focus, instead of actually creating their cell-based meat, they're now creating cell-based growth media. Sorry, I should refrain from commenting any further. But in terms of like the insect play and the insect acceptance, I'm curious to hear what Gary and Cessna have to say about that. By the way, the dessert was delicious, and it was the only thing that actually, there was none left at the end of the night. That and the Karana dish as well. Very good, jackfruit.
Yeah, I think that in terms of the cricket protein or insect protein, I think that definitely varies by market. I think to what Gary said earlier, it's still solving a problem. All these ideas are still worthy, but I do think it might vary as in terms of customer acceptance. How across different markets, whether or not that's already kind of weaved into the diet, and it doesn't mean that you can't start building that market or building that acceptance, but it is a larger challenge. So I guess a funny anecdote is that one of the forerunners of cricket protein to the US is Exo, and the founder of Exo, his name is Gabby Lewis. He is very upfront about sharing the challenges of educating the market, building the brand, figuring out what products might work. And he's actually now the founder of a CPG direct-to-consumer cereal company called Magic Spoon. And he often juxtaposes his experience of trying to build a new category versus build an exciting brand in a category that people are already familiar with. And so I think he's written a couple of articles. It's a very I think again, all ideas are worthy, but it's what challenge are you ready for?
I think here in Europe, kind of the breakaway successes, YNSECT, YNSECT. Asnor Ventures, I think, led 100+ million rounds. Maybe it was last year, maybe it was longer than that. And I didn't know prior to kind of diving into the space that, 2 billion people do eat, insects on a regular basis for especially their protein needs. So Western markets, for sure, it's going to be a little bit difficult in terms of consumer acceptance, but it could happen. For us, we've decided to shy away from that topic simply for two reasons. Some of these different organisms just, again, have more inherent advantages. With insects, they are doing unique breeding to create, species that are more social, so they stay together and they're not flying away from the factory. But compared to, again, fungi and bacterial and microalgae, it doesn't have the inherent efficiencies. And then secondly, from potentially this animal welfare, angle, we don't know, dug a little bit into the research. There's arguments on both sides, do these creatures feel pain? They don't apparently have nervous systems. There's definitely some stimuli response that happens. So for us, we just decided to, not focus on that sector for now.
Actually, Gary, you mentioned insect, or however we pronounce it, but that goes back to Shinyi's question earlier. They're essentially a B2B player, right? Animal feed. So kind of remove the hurdle of a human consumer out of it and recognize the inherent sort of possibilities and opportunities in creating a high protein source out of insects, just not feeding them to humans.
We have a couple of companies
because
in the
we
US
are running out of time. I'm really sorry, but we filled the hour and a half really quickly. And so I do have to stop you there, even though I feel like this could go on for a long time. There's just so much to discuss around this topic. And if you want to find out more, there are notes from this call will go onto our platform, the TFF Digital Labs. And we're also actually currently running a challenge with GFI in India on plant-based protein, plant-based protein challenge. So check it out. The deadline is mid-July, so you have a few weeks to apply for it. And finally, for more live sessions, do come on the Thought for Food website and see what else is coming up. All those links are in the chat for you as well. But for now, thank you to our wonderful panel. It's been really insightful and really great to hear from you and to have the perspectives from the different sides of the world. And thank you, Ayna and Sujala, for this wonderful moderation as well. And to the attendees, of course, for all the questions. And if you want to follow up with us, please do so on any of the social media accounts. All right, well, with that, have a wonderful day or a wonderful evening, depending on where you are. And I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Everyone.